The Japanese overwhelmed the Koreans when they invaded the peninsula in May of 1592. They drove the Koreans into retreat and marched almost unopposed to Seoul in under 3 weeks. The Koreans, of course, were unprepared for this onslaught. They hadn't fully acknowledged the threat posed by Hideyoshi, and so they hadn't taken adequate defensive measures. That was a big reason for their inability to resist the invasion. Another big factor, though, was that the Japanese had guns and the Koreans didn't. Now, from our perspective today, we tend to think of a gun as giving someone an impossible advantage over someone who doesn't have a gun, someone armed with, say, a bow and arrows. I mean, an army with guns will always defeat an army with bows and arrows and other traditional weapons, right? I mean, a gun is just so inherently superior, right? There's no question. Well, actually, there is a question. And in this episode, we're going to ask it. Why was the gun so effective? The answer isn't as obvious as you might think. It's amazing to think about, really, but prior to the introduction of the gun into warfare, in a major way from the early 1500s, warfare hadn't changed that much for nearly 2,000 years. Armies all around the world, they fought each other with essentially the same weapons: bows and arrows, mounted cavalry, swords, spears, shields, and so on. And they were more or less equally deadly. You could take Alexander the Great's army from around 300 BC and transport it forward in time to face an English army in around 1400 AD, and they'd have stood roughly an equal chance against each other. A Roman army from around the time of Christ against a Japanese army in 1200 AD? Again, it could go either way. You could take any competent professional army from between, say, 500 BC and 1500 AD and set them against each other, and it's going to be a toss-up who will win. You could push this back even farther, back into the Bronze Age, back to the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Hittites, if you were to let those armies use iron weapons instead of their bronze ones. So warfare hadn't changed that much in 2,000 years. And then along comes the gun. Okay, so it's the 16th century. What is a gun? It's a matchlock musket, a very crude weapon that was essentially a lightweight cannon that could be carried around and fired by one man. It was fired using a smoldering wick, a match, threaded through an S-shaped device called a lock. That's where the name comes from, matchlock. When you pulled the trigger, the lock, with its glowing match, snapped down into the powder charge. There'd be a split-second delay. Then, boom! The powder would ignite and the gun would fire. So, what were the strengths of this new weapon? Well, it had greater striking power than a bow and arrows. At closer ranges, a musket could pierce armor that arrows couldn't. A musket also had a marginally greater range, up to maybe 500 meters, for an extremely high-angled, unaimed shot. This, though, wasn't really a very big factor, since battles were generally fought at much closer distances than that. More important, a musket fired cheap ammunition. Lead balls were cheap and easy to make. Arrows, on the other hand, were relatively expensive. Now, as for the musket's weaknesses, well, first, it was difficult to use a musket in the rain. I mean, this thing has a smoldering wick on it to fire it, and you have to keep that thing lit. If it's raining, it's going to go out. So if you have an army armed with muskets, you don't want to fight battles in the rain. The gunpowder that a musket uses, you also have to keep it dry, not just from rain, but from humidity. If the gunpowder is wet or just damp, it's not going to fire, and your musket is nothing more than a club. A bow and arrows are much more durable than that. And finally, and now here we come to the big one, the musket's big weakness, it had a slow rate of fire. I mean, take a look at all these steps that you had to go through to fire just one shot from a musket. Pour a charge of powder down the barrel. Tamp the powder down. Insert a lead ball. Tamp down the lead ball. Insert a piece of cloth to keep the ball and powder in place. Tamp the cloth down. Open the flashpan cover. Pour in a bit of flash powder. Shoulder your musket. Take aim. Fire! Clean out the barrel and start all over again. All this took nearly a minute. Compare that to a skilled archer who can fire at least 6 well-aimed arrows in a minute. You fire 1 lead ball at him in a minute? Sure, it'll punch a nasty hole in him if it hits. It might even kill him. But in the meantime, he's fired 6 arrows back at you. Okay, so then what made the gun so superior? Here's the real reason. To become a skilled archer took years of training and practice. To use the most powerful bows, for example, that took a lot of upper body strength. An average Joe would have had difficulty even drawing back the string. Same thing with other weapons, swords and the like. It took years to master them, to become proficient. It took years to become a professional soldier. And it therefore took years for a king, for a prince, a daimyo lord, to assemble a professional army. But the gun, the matchlock musket, that's a different story. Yes, it's slow to load and fire, but you can train a man to use one in just a few weeks. You can turn him into a deadly soldier in just a few weeks. So that means a king, a prince, a daimyo, he can assemble a professional army quickly. Round up a bunch of men from the fields, the markets, the gutter, wherever, shove a musket in their hands, give them a few weeks of training, and you've got yourself a professional army. That's why the gun was such a game changer. It wasn't that it was so inherently superior. It really wasn't, not in its early primitive form, the matchlock musket. It was that anyone could be quickly trained to be deadly with one. In fact, it made a soldier a bit like a disposable commodity. Previously, a professional soldier, a man proficient with a bow, with a sword, on horseback in a cavalry charge, whatever, he was a valuable thing. He represented years of experience, years of training, years of effort to mold himself into an effective killer. But a man with a gun, he requires only minimal training to use it. So he's cheap. And if he gets killed, well, he can be easily replaced. And yet, on the field of battle, he can hold his own against this highly trained, traditionally armed warrior. He stands at least as good a chance of killing him with his musket as of being killed by an arrow. So the musket, the matchlock musket, adopting it was just a no-brainer. The musket played a crucial role in the Japanese invasion of Korea. The Koreans instantly saw its value and started trying to manufacture similar weapons for themselves. With the country in such disarray, however, they were never able to equip their forces with anywhere near the number of muskets that the Japanese had. They weren't entirely without firepower, however. The Koreans didn't have muskets, but what they did have was cannons. The Koreans had warships armed with cannons. That's what we'll be talking about in the next episode. How the Korean Navy under Lee Sun-shin turned the tide of the Japanese invasion. That's next. If you like watching these videos, please consider subscribing. I'll see you next time.